I just remember kind of losing the fear little by little. As I lost the fear, I realized that I didn't really have to be a Christian if I didn't want to, if it wasn't working for me.
Welcome to Voices of Deconversion. We share the inspirational stories of deconversion told by former Christians who are now atheist or agnostic. Our stories remind us we're in it together. They encourage us as we discover who we are and help us to embrace who we become. Now here's Steve with today's guest.
Welcome back for episode 38. My guest today attends the University of Puerto Rico. She recently joined the Secular Student Alliance there. She was born in Puerto Rico and, as a young child, had to move back to the States. She was raised in a very evangelical home. Her aunt had her own church, her dad's been a preacher as long as she can remember, and her stepfather is a pastor. She remembers Christian music being on constantly in her home. In adolescence, she experienced some major life events. Some of these things she saw coming. Others were her response to her Christian upbringing and a lifelong desire to become less for God and family. These things that she went through were hard enough, but when family found out, it made things much more difficult. So difficult that before she had graduated high school, her mother forced her to move back to Puerto Rico with her father. As with all of my guests, it's a real privilege for me to be able to sit down and have my guests share their story with me. I'm so impressed by the courage and the perseverance that it takes for people to get through such difficult life circumstances. It takes a very strong person to be so open about such vulnerable times in life. I was really inspired and encouraged by her story, and I think all of you will be too. And now, my interview with Vilmarie Perez. Vilmarie, thanks so much for joining me today.
Thank you for having me.
When people ask you, do you say you're an atheist, agnostic, or is there another term that you prefer to use?
I'm an atheist. I've been saying that casually for a few years now, so that's usually what I say.
Let's start with kind of the beginning of your story. So, in what ways was Christianity a part of your childhood? How did it influence you when you were young?
It was pretty much the air we breathed. I remember my aunt, when I was a child, she had her own church, and my dad's been a preacher ever since I can remember. So I just remember having Christian music playing in the house just constantly. Like, we would go on camping trips, and that was the music that we would listen to. We'd go to church, and church life always kind of spilled into home life in a lot of ways. And so, yeah, I was raised evangelical. My family's evangelical on both sides right now. So, yeah, I was born here on the island, and that was like the one thing that never changed. Like, we were just constantly in church. Once I moved out when I was about 6 or 7, we just joined a different church. So yeah, it's been a constant.
How old were you when you moved?
I was about 6 or 7.
Okay, 6 or 7, and you moved to the States, you said?
Yes.
Okay. So Christian music was always on, like, wherever you guys were going. I think you mentioned that, was it your father and stepfather were preachers? Or just your father?
Yeah, my stepfather's a pastor. He's got his own church. And my father, he does Bible study lessons, and he's also a preacher. He's been that for many years.
Okay.
So,
and so as long as you've known him, like, growing up, he was a preacher from, as early as you can remember?
Yeah.
Okay. And then how about your mom? Like, what's her faith like, or how does Christianity play out in her life?
She's very, very religious, very spiritual, she calls it. And she's been in church her whole life. Her parents raised her, I suppose, Pentecostal. A lot of the people that I was surrounded by during my upbringing were either coming out of Pentecostal churches or were Pentecostal themselves. So it was like this sort of looser version, I suppose, of that very strict sect of Christianity.
Yeah.
I remember my mom telling me that it was a big deal for her to wear pants. So
Wow.
yeah, they were like, it was like a skirt thing for women, and like very conservative Pentecostals discourage women from even shaving, I believe, or they used to.
Wow.
So she was in the middle of like that transition here on the island where women were starting to, wear clothes that were deemed worldly.
Oh my gosh. That's crazy. I mean, I have heard of churches where like women can only wear dresses. I had a guest on who was a part of a cult, and so of course like the women had dresses, and pants were like never, never okay and stuff like that. But it's interesting in the Pentecostal world, my experience, just I mean, I'm in the Seattle area, but has not been like that. Like it's, you'll have your real fundamentalist churches, but they're like the ones I ran into weren't so Pentecostal. But that's
Right.
interesting. That's really interesting to me that like it kind of combined this real like kind of rigid fundamentalism in the way that they dressed on top of
Yeah.
like the Pentecostal experience.
Yeah, and it's still very similar in the evangelical circles. Not so much with dress code and like um don't go to the movies, stuff like that. But
Yeah.
the emotional, I guess, side of it is very similar. And yeah, now it's kind of like a stereotype for old people here, where like
Oh,
old women with like buns and like skirts and stuff, and it's
yeah.
like, yeah.
That's funny. Well, you mentioned the movies. So was that ever a thing? Like, were you guys allowed to go to the movies when you were young?
Oh, yeah, definitely. My father remembered that in his churches when he was growing up, they used to tell him that going to the movies was a sin.
Wow. Like any
Yeah.
like any movie.
Yeah. Yeah.
Wow. That's crazy. So, do you have any brothers or sisters?
I have three siblings, and they're
Hmm.
all in the States. I've had many step siblings, but mostly from my dad's. My dad's been remarried twice after my mother. So yeah, and countless cousins. So
What was it like for you? Did that affect you significantly you know, having to adjust to new siblings, multiple times growing up?
that, yeah, that was an adjustment. It was tough because they, my brother and my sister, are actually only about a year apart. So it was like, a lot coming in, and the youngest one, she's only 5, so
Hmm.
that was pretty recent, and I thought my mom was done, so that was a surprise. But
Now they're all younger, so have you seen Christianity affect them in any way, or how have they kind of responded to the same or similar upbringing to you?
they're very into it so far.
They're
Um, my
young, yeah.
issues with, yeah, my issues with the faith weren't really evident until I was like entering adolescence. So I guess we'll find out
Hmm.
about that. But
Yeah.
I know like the conflicts between my mother and I around the faith really did affect them, and that's why ultimately we decided that I should live here with my father.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay, so you said it was like in adolescence when you started to kind of maybe question things. Prior to that, were you just kind of going along like with everything as normal? Like
Yeah.
you considered
I
yourself a Christian and
I had my doubts. I did consider myself a Christian for all that time,
uh-huh.
but there was a lot of inner conflict. I knew, for example, I knew I was a lesbian since I was a child. I didn't have the word for it exactly, and I couldn't really articulate what was going on, but I knew that, I was having thoughts that were, I'm getting from the outside all these messages that are, don't think that, don't feel that, and so that was always an issue for me. But it wasn't until like I really got into just being on the internet constantly, like any other teenager, that I started to come into contact with other points of view. So
Mm-hmm. Okay. So you had your doubts kind of at a young age, kind of here and there. When did you start to what came first, coming out as a lesbian, or was it coming out about like your doubts? What was kind of the first thing that started to
it was kind of simultaneous. There was a lot going on. I was around 14 or 15, and I was seeing a psychotherapist for my eating disorder. Um, and I remember that like a lot of the emotions that I was sort of channeling through the food problems had to do with my doubts about the faith. And one of the things that happened, which is really funny, like I would be on the internet watching like Real Time with Bill Maher and stuff like
Oh
that.
yeah.
I just remember kind of losing the fear little by little, because the big thing was like the whole going against God verbally sort of thing. Like I was afraid of these people who were saying these things that I thought were blasphemous. But like
Mm-hmm.
as I lost the fear, I realized that I didn't really have to be a Christian if I didn't want to, if it wasn't working for me. But then, I mean, coming out of the closet was kind of like the final step, and that was around I was 16 when that happened.
When you say verbally going against God, do you just mean articulating like out loud, like I'm not a Christian, that kind of thing, or do you mean something else?
That kind of thing, and also this very unapologetic ridicule that I was seeing online, where it was like, I mean, I saw Religulous on my laptop from school, and I remember thinking, "Holy crap! Like, this guy's saying all these things, and like nothing's happening to him." And I remember like thinking, okay, well, maybe these beliefs are kind of out there. So it was kind of that really big step of saying, okay, I'm not going to be struck dead if I say something that
It,
isn't.
yeah.
Yeah.
So it's almost like it normalized it to be able to watch the Bill Maher, show or
Yeah, yeah, and also that these weren't like the monsters that my parents made them out to be. This whole separation of like, us and them. I always thought like atheists were scary people, or the world out there was scary. But
yeah. And Bill Maher can be
I,
edgy, but he's funny and he's just kind of a regular guy. And
yeah, yeah, yeah.
yeah, yeah, we saw that movie when it came out when it was in the theaters. That was really soon after I actually deconverted, so that was quite a while ago. But now, but yeah, it's interesting. So you're on the internet, and I'm interested too how it contrasts kind of with I can't help but think about my own experience when you're talking, but you had like growing up, you had the internet all the time. Like I kind of didn't the whole time. I was about 12 or 13
Right,
when it was
right.
really getting big. So it's interesting to me to hear how using the internet, um, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, but was the internet a part of kind of exposing you to other beliefs? And I mean, I think you just said that, but
Oh,
yeah,
absolutely. I was always very curious, like as a child. Like I loved reading books and everything, but when I had like, unlimited access to the internet, it was just like a punch in the face. Like it was like, oh my God, like I had no idea that
did
all
you,
these people were
uh-huh.
saying all these things online and making all these movies. Jesus Camp as well was a heavy movie for me
That was good. Yeah,
because
because we each of us has had experience with Pentecostal stuff. So that like
right.
movie was very heavily kind of focused on that
Right, like the whole
experience.
speaking in tongues thing, I remember being instructed to speak in tongues literally in church. Like there was one of our youth leaders who, I mean, she was a little bit she was interesting. I remember she lined us up one day. She lined up all the youth one day and she was like, "Okay, so you guys are going to speak in tongues today." And I'm like, "Oh, just like that?" Because I mean, I always thought it was this spontaneous thing, but she sort of, I guess, got the music going and everything, and she was like, "It's gonna happen now, and you have to just let it happen." And so
That's so
a couple of
crazy.
my friends, yeah, it was funny because
You're like, oh,
we were all
okay.
so and we were all so like not ready for it. And a couple of my friends just started like, mumbling a couple of things just to get her off, their backs, because she would come and pray for us one by one.
Mm-hmm.
And when it was my turn, I just stood there and I froze, and I was like, I can't. This is so that was,
Yeah,
watching Jesus Camp, I was like, yeah, that's something that happens. Like
that's really fast.
telling young people to
Yeah.
have these like 10 spiritual experiences.
I've always wondered if the internet helps younger generations kind of move away from real fundamentalist faith, even if they move to kind of a liberal spirituality of some sort. I've always been curious about that. Like, I would think that would be true, and it's encouraging for me to hear that. Like, it kind of did help you, kind of exposed you to some stuff. What do you mean when you say it was a punch in the face?
I mean, at first I was like, can people like this is not right. Like people can't say this stuff, It was like it was like outrage at first. That's the first reaction
Mm-hmm.
when you see something that's really out of your not in line with your worldview, you kind of get angry.
Yeah.
And little by little, I was like, okay, well, maybe they're right, or maybe they have a point. And then And then I remember having this like distinct moment where I was like, oh my God, I'm one of them. I can't believe it.
Oh, really? You had that moment where you were like, "Oh, I think I totally agree with them," or "I think I agree with what they're saying."
Yeah, and it was scary because I was like, I know I'm gonna get, a lot of problems because of this. Like I
Mm-hmm.
know my parents are gonna have a huge issue with it. My mother was very upset.
Oh, okay. Well, how old were you then when you kind of
15,
realized
16.
15? Yes, yeah, like you said, it kind of all happened around the same time.
Yeah, in the last
Yeah.
few months before I moved out, that was just very quick. Actually, I had to move out in a day.
Dude,
So
that's crazy.
yeah.
Well, let's talk about that, I guess, because that seems, I've kind of gotten the background a little bit. Actually, just before we jump into that, you had mentioned that you developed an eating disorder partly because of this whole like becoming less as a Christian. Can you talk about that a
Yeah.
little bit? Because I'm really curious to hear like how that impact how the faith kind of impacted you in that way.
Because I was having doubts, I I couldn't really um I guess participate in this sort of cyclical constantly asking for forgiveness thing that I used to do. I remember I went to Christian therapy for this really tough situation when I was about 12. I was sent to Christian therapy, and I remember this therapist would tell me that I was stuck in like a cycle of sin. And so I remember whenever I would have any problem really with my parents, especially this one, they would they would go through my stuff, and like my iPod was um, kind of switched around for me. Like they put Christian music on my iPod so that I would listen and sort of, I guess, come back to God. But it was really guilt-inducing kind of music.
Yeah.
So I would get into this you know, this kind of cyclical thing where I would, I guess, screw up, I guess if you can call it that,
Mm-hmm.
screw up again, and then sort of ask for forgiveness. And it was just like a constant um, release of just like guilty, heavy, heavy emotions.
Yeah.
So when I didn't have that anymore, I had to fixate on something else.
Mm-hmm.
Like it was always this need to control or reduce what I was feeling.
Mm-hmm.
So around eighth grade, it was when, of course, everybody starts worrying about body image and everything like
Mm-hmm.
that. It was like occasional restricting, and then it turned into purging, and then um, before I knew it, I had a full-blown eating disorder, and my parents had found out. So,
So they were doing the iPod stuff, like controlling what you listened to before they found out about all of this, or was that in response to it?
I mean, I had media limited
Yeah.
in some ways, but it was sort of like it wasn't always constant. Sometimes my mom would be kind of lenient about it. But this whole iPod thing happened after around the time I was 12. Like they just
Oh.
decided um, I don't know what the music I listened to had to do with what happened. I have no idea what they thought was happening, but yeah, like for example, if we were going through my iTunes library, like my stepfather would point to like any song that had like the little explicit square on it, and he would be like, okay, let's remove that one,
Oh my
even if
God.
it was like one word, and
Wow.
so yeah, I remember this song called like Two Hands or something. I forget the name of the band, but that song made me feel so guilty, and that was like what I was listening to on a daily basis. It was like
Just guilt.
intense.
Yeah, intense guilt-inducing stuff.
Yeah.
What was your parents' response then to finding out? So they found out you had an eating disorder, and what was their response to that?
Yeah, I think I was about 14, 13 or 14. Um, I remember like all this food would go missing, and they noticed that because I was still shrinking, but I was eating all this food, so that
Mm,
didn't add up. My stepfather was very, you know, understanding about it. He was like, we're going to get you help, um, and he wanted to sort of be, I guess, the mediator between me and my mother because my mother was very angry. I
oh,
remember she walked into my room and sort of like accused me of purging in like this really, and I knew she was going to be pissed. So at first I denied it, and then I kind of broke down because I knew that, I couldn't really keep it up any longer.
wow.
So
That's like
yeah,
the absolute worst way someone could respond when someone's going through something like that.
right. And I had several I guess like emotional or mental health problems growing up. So and these were kind of like, I guess, episodic.
Mm-hmm.
Just every once in a while something would happen. My mother would get angry. That was her response. And so like I guess internalized that like these emotional issues were just like not to be shared, or they were you know, I guess an inconvenience.
Yeah.
So it was, yeah, it was tough once I moved out to the island with my father. I just kind of decided like not to, deal with this stuff any longer until very recently. Then I got back into therapy, and yeah, and a lot of the things that I talk about is the Christian upbringing. That's
Yeah.
like a big deal in therapy.
Yeah, absolutely. And one thing that's sticking out to me when I'm hearing you talk about all this stuff is with them kind of like basically being pretty invasive and making you listen to the kind of music they want you to listen to, and your mom being so angry. I feel like there's a whole lot of control that is taken away from you when you were, I mean, from a
Hmm.
young age. Um,
Yeah,
and I I can see how a person's response is like, I need to take control back. I need to take control back of my life, even as a young
right,
adolescent, you know?
exactly. I had this really crazy moment with my mom when I was about 8, and I never forget it because it's like I've always loved writing, and so when I was about 8, I knew that I knew I was attracted to women, but I didn't really, have any word for what was happening. I remember my first crush was Raven Simone from the show That's So Raven. I used to love that show, and like I had like a huge crush on her. I wrote this down in a notebook, and my mother found it, and she sort of read it aloud in my face, and it was just like the face that she made that kind of just like at that moment I knew this was like a huge shameful thing. Like this was not like I
Wow.
just couldn't talk about it. And to this day I have like um, issues with saving things that I wrote. I never kept a journal because my mother would find them, or she would sort of find something in my backpack, disapprove of what I was reading or writing.
Yeah.
And so I still, like, I've been writing all these years and I have no records. And it's really frustrating because I still have this habit of, like, I've kind of adopted the role of policing my writing
Mm.
according to, I guess, these Christian ideals, even though I don't hold them anymore. I look at what I write and I disapprove of it and I try to remove it.
Yeah,
So,
and that's hard because, like you said, then, like, that's your history and that's kind of the things you went through, and you want to be able to look back at that. But because of kind of what you
yeah.
went through and the kind of that traumatic, I mean, that's pretty traumatic to me, like to have someone basically go through your stuff, intermittently, to pull stuff out that's really personal and like verbalize it. I mean,
Hmm.
sometimes we write things down because it's so hard to say it. Like, it
Right.
helps us get it out without, saying it out loud or whatever. Even if you're a parent, I get the whole parent thing, like wanting to
Hmm.
protect your kids, but yeah, on your
Right.
end of it, it's not protection. It's like invading your privacy and like kind of violating that trust.
I took out a book from the library once about Wicca, and my mother found it, and that was a whole thing. And it was almost, I mean, it's funny now to me, but in the moment I was terrified. Like she was so angry, and I had to go back there. She was like, "You're gonna go return this to the library right now." And
So I'm really interested to hear how one, I think it probably was like, I assume it was a really really good thing when you moved out, probably for you,
um,
or no?
it was at first it was very, very difficult. Just because I had my whole life in the States, and my mom literally told me, "You're gonna pack your stuff and like move like this weekend, like you're out." So it was, it, I mean, in that it was so quick to happen, it was traumatic. And what I was expecting was more what scared me, because like any idea that I had of the island came from, summer vacations with my dad and like childhood memories and stuff because I'd been born there. But um, it was always from the point of view of my evangelical family and sort of like that sort of circle of people. So I was expecting a lot of rejection, as a lesbian, and as an atheist, when I came here, and I was ready to just essentially spend my life alone. I was like, I don't know what I'm going to do with all this. I don't know what these people are like because I haven't been able to stay for an extended period of time and go out and make friends.
Mm-hmm.
But when I got to the university, it was completely different. I mean, I'm studying at the University of Puerto Rico. I mean, the community here is I mean, it's a beautiful thing. I feel understood for the first time in my life.
That's really amazing. That's so cool.
Yeah.
So I kind of skipped ahead a little bit. So what led up to you having to move out?
A lot of arguments, a lot of fights in the house. And I recognized that it was the best for the kids because I mean, they were little and they didn't really need all that, turmoil in the house. So it was the best for everybody.
Yeah.
Um, but what led up to it was, it was just we were coming to terms with the fact that we were not going to be able to, I guess, coexist peacefully. Because I mean, we spent a lot of time in church. I mean, my stepfather he was a pastor in a church that was out of state. We had it wasn't that far, but it was, it was a good maybe 45-minute drive depending on traffic and everything.
Okay.
And so, every weekend we would be there, twice, Fridays and Sundays. Sometimes we would go Wednesdays, and then if there was an activity on Saturday, we would have that too. So my life was literally just go to school, go home, go to church. And I was feeling very restricted, and I was kind of lashing out because of that.
Yeah.
So that was the whole deal
So
with us.
that was kind of building. So they knew about your eating disorder early, like, because that was several years before that. When did they find out that you were an atheist?
I never outright said I'm an atheist. They just noticed because I was questioning so much, and I was kind of like pulling out verses of the Bible, like, what about this one? Like, like, what? How do you explain this?
Asking too many questions.
Right, I was asking way too many questions, and I did outwardly express that I didn't want to go to church anymore, that I said I didn't want to be a Christian. I never said I'm an atheist, which I know is kind of the same thing, but I guess the word atheist would have been very heavy at the moment.
Yeah.
But I came out of the closet at 16, so that was a big deal too.
Okay.
And my mother looked at me like I was a monster, and I still can't get over that face. It was very hard.
What made you want to even tell her, knowing that she might respond in a negative way?
I was meeting someone at school, my first girlfriend, and I liked her a lot, and she had recently come out of the closet, and it kind of inspired me because she was like so kick-ass about it, And then it was almost out of spite that I told my mother, because she had been arguing with me for a long time about me not telling her things, which, it was always hard for me to tell her things because, she would get so angry.
Yeah.
But, I kind of like, okay, you want to have a better relationship, you want to know what's up, well, I'm gay. And I recognize, in her defense, I didn't sit her down or anything and say, Mom, I want to talk to you about something.
Yeah.
All that preamble. But so yeah, she was really shocked, and she was very angry, and it was really hard for me to be okay with myself after that for a long time.
You were really brave to, well, one, you've gone through a lot. I mean, to talk about it publicly, there's a lot of people who deal with all of these issues that you're dealing with or have dealt with, and it's really courageous of you to talk about it, and to stand up to you had to stand up to your mom in a way. Like, you had to kind of stand up for yourself and say, like, basically, these are non-negotiables, Mom. This is who I am, and I assume you wanted a relationship with her if she was willing to accept you for who you were, but it seems that that's kind of where she drew the line.
Yeah. And it was hard for me to sort of process that. But
Yeah.
I mean, the move was really good for us in the end. We're much more civil now.
Oh, good.
Than we were before. And she comes to visit, and I go to visit her sometimes, and The last visit was very interesting. I went to visit her one Christmas, and I've been on the island for about 5 years now. So I had almost forgotten how intense it was to be in church. And I had been blogging about it, um, kind of anonymously with, other ex-Christians talking about what it was like growing up in church and
Mm-hmm.
everything. And I was sort of recovering memories. It was weird because a lot of things that I heard in church I had forgotten, or they were so stressful for me that I was like, let me just not
Mm-hmm.
think about that right now. But I
So
totally,
being back in church brought back these memories.
yeah, yeah, yeah. And I remember I sat in the back of the temple, I guess, and the sermon. I didn't remember just how much shouting it involved until I was there, and I was like, oh wow, like this was me every weekend, and I'm here for literally just Christmas, and I can't stand this. It's like, you know, and my sister brought me an old journal that I had, and this was like a Sunday school journal, and I drew a little person in a prison or something, and it was like something about God's love setting you free or something like that. It was like, today I learned this in Sunday school, blah blah blah, and I just remember at that time there was terrible things happening, like, within, me and my mind, but
Yeah.
outwardly I had to be like, oh, everything's great, and I
Right.
love God and everything, and I just remember thinking, like, I can't believe I was that person at one point.
Yeah.
Or I remember thinking as well, like, that child, if she were to see me now, she would be absolutely appalled.
Yeah.
So it's like such a like stark contrast, such a disconnect
But like,
where
look,
I feel like I'm two people.
yeah, yeah. But like, you knew looking back, like you were Christian on the outside, but there was a lot, or you were this good,
Right.
perfect, like good Christian on the outside, but like, you knew, like reading back through that, like I was going through so much during that time.
Right,
Yeah.
right. And I would have never admitted it at the time.
Yeah, and I think that's like cognitive dissonance, right? Like there's things going on, but we're not
Oh yeah.
acknowledging them, you know?
Yeah.
Well, in spite of all the difficult stuff that you went through at a young age, what do you think in the midst of all that was the most helpful for you? What helped you get through that time in your life, or those times in your
Um,
life?
Ironically, it was music, even though music was what got me into Christianity in the first place. I come from a very musical family. There's a
Mm-hmm.
lot of musicians. My mom has played piano for all her life, and she played piano in the church. And, you know, at first it was a source of kind of, it was almost like a hypnotic thing where like the belief would perpetuate itself in my head through the music.
Mm.
But it was also me trying to like wiggle myself out of my mother's like musical policing
Mm-hmm.
that got me through. I couldn't really get too much into pop music because it was too worldly, or it was too sexual, it was this, it was that. Um, but I remember like I would look for songs online and stuff, and I would, oh, I like this song, and then it was like, oh, it sounds relaxed enough. It sounds like something my mother would not suspect. Or, meanwhile the lyrics were like all
Wow.
these other things going on. Like I would, there's a song called "You Will Leave a Mark," and it's like it's a song about guilt, but it's sort of a release where you realize that it's coming from, somebody's reaction to you, that you feel a certain way.
Mm-hmm.
So stuff like that. It was listening to music. It was being on the internet, talking to people, and I also went to a high school that was very diverse in the student body. I just remember like very specific things. Like there's a music video by Gautier called oh my gosh, it's called "Don't Worry, We'll Be Watching You," and it's sort of like this. I A lot of people read it as like a commentary on, I guess, cult-like organizations, and you know it's a really creepy video, and I realized like, oh, it's very scary to get sort of sucked into this group where, you where on the outside it's very friendly and it's a very loving space, but caught up in things that are, that really put you at war with yourself, I think.
Mm.
Like I remember like church was always everybody was hugging each other, and it was like newcomers were always welcome with, just all this love.
Mm-hmm.
And it was almost like we had even a slogan, I think, at one point where it was like loving people into something about a relationship with God. I don't remember it specifically, but that's the, I guess, stage one
Yeah.
is like the fellowship, like the being very friendly, and then eventually, and I wouldn't say it's like it's not a very it's I don't consider it a church where people are put down or anything like that.
Mm-hmm.
I consider it a very loving space in a lot of ways. But it's just like a lot of the mentality on the outside world that sort of keeps you in the group, kind of isolates you in a way.
Yeah.
Especially this whole idea of I remember being like all these sermons about you know, the youth going into university, going into college, that we were told that, we would get lost if we weren't careful and stuff like
Yeah.
that. Like, university where you go to meet new people and expand your mind and learn new things
Yeah.
was a dangerous place, according to church.
That's a big deal.
Yeah, I mean, people would be prayed over before going to, like, intensely prayed over before going to
Oh
college.
my
It was
God.
like, God protect the youth and yeah. And I remember being a little bit scared, but once I got here, it's like it's a very relaxed sort of space. It's quite the opposite.
It's really unfortunate that the church can sometimes make that seem so scary and so negative.
Yeah.
Yeah. So you found
Hmm.
something totally different. So when you got to, I don't want to, I wanted to ask you another thing before I talked about your college stuff. When you moved, you said
Hmm.
at first it was difficult, but then it became a good thing ultimately. What was it like when you first? So you said it was all in a day, right? So you guys must have gotten into an argument and then you just
Yeah.
left, or you were told to leave, or
Yeah, my mother left to go to the grocery store, she said, and then when she came back, she was like, "I have your ticket, like you're leaving."
she seriously
And it
like bought
was,
an airline ticket and brought it back and was
yeah,
like,
she bought an airline ticket and brought it back, and she told me that I would be leaving. And it was a
"Whoa,
weekend. I couldn't say goodbye to any of my friends from school, no, you know, and it was really hard for me because that year specifically, things were going really well. Um, that was 11th grade, and I had so many people like in the school community that I really appreciated, and I would have loved to, see one last time. But
yeah."
you know,
Were you able to reconnect with any of them later?
I wrote this post on Facebook where I was like, "You guys, this is like really short notice, but I'm leaving." And but yeah, I was able to. I visited a couple of my teachers when I went back, and a couple of my friends I got to see. So
That's really
yeah.
cool. Well, I'm glad that that happened because
Mhm.
that, I mean, I'm sure that was extremely like difficult to just up and go and not be able to say goodbye to anybody.
It was really, really hard.
Yeah. Well, when you got to Puerto Rico, um,
Hmm.
so what was that transition like for you? Moving, now you're living with your dad. It's also a religious environment for you in that home, but it was a
Right.
different religious environment. So how was it different?
It was different in the sense that I didn't have like I guess a home church for a while because I had my grandma's house on the one hand. She's my grandmother from my mother's side, and that's the house I grew up in when I was really little, and like had I was really comfortable there. So there was I guess a whole group with them, and then there was my father's church, and I was kind of going back and forth.
Hmm.
It was kind of like re-experiencing things that I remember from childhood. I mean, it was almost exactly the same people at my dad's church that I mean, they'd known me since I was a kid. So it was very uncomfortable because I wasn't sure who knew why I was there
Oh, yeah.
or what had happened. So I kept to myself for a while.
But he knew. I mean, obviously
Yeah,
she's
he
she's
knew,
like
yeah.
she's gonna come live with you or whatever.
Hmm. And it was as crazy for him to hear that because he was just like all of a sudden, oh, okay, my daughter's living with me now, and he wasn't ready at
Wow.
all. He didn't even have. We shared a room for a while actually because the place was so small.
And he knew you weren't Christian and he knew you were gay.
Yeah,
Okay.
all of a sudden, I didn't even get to come out to him. My mother told him that.
Wow.
Yeah, so it was a lot.
Well, and how was how did he was shocked, but how did he adjust to that?
He has been very very accepting within his beliefs, and
Wow.
I've been very surprised. We've had our arguments, we've had
Mm-hmm.
some fights about, you know, things in the house and stuff, but
Yeah.
he
That's really nice. I mean, that's good to hear.
yeah, and he recognizes that he's coming into like a sort of like a different kind of Christianity. And I give him a lot of credit for that because it's tough to, change your beliefs, especially when you've had them for so
Oh
long.
yeah.
I mean, I'm pretty young still, but I mean, he's been like that for years and years.
Wow.
So yeah, we have a pretty good relationship. So it was very refreshing.
Well, that's cool.
Yeah.
Let's talk about, so you finished your high school, like your senior year in Puerto
Yeah,
Rico?
here.
Okay.
Yeah, and it was like a scramble for me to like fix my Spanish because I had been out for 10 years. So it was like it was like, God, I have to get up to par to go to
Oh,
university.
yeah, that would be a little intimidating.
Yeah. Yeah, it was at first. I got comfortable pretty quickly though. I had amazing teachers. Like I was very I was just overwhelmed with the support that I got and just their hard work and
Wow.
everything that they did for me.
That's really cool.
Yeah.
So you graduate from high school, and that was pretty recently. Well, not pretty recently. Sorry, it was a couple years ago.
Years ago, but yeah.
So then what made you decide to go to the University of Puerto Rico?
No money, so it's pretty cheap here. Although not for long.
Uh-huh.
We've got some ugh, financial troubles now, so yeah, it's getting heavy here. So that was the. I mean, it was my first choice, and I didn't really have a lot of options really,
Uh-huh.
and I was actually really. I kind of got depressed after high school,
Hmm.
because I was like, I thought they weren't going to accept me, and I thought that like I wasn't going to do anything. Like I literally just had no idea what I was going to do. And I wasn't sure if I wanted to go back to the
Mm-hmm.
States, if, I had no idea. So, but when I got the acceptance letter, like everything changed for me, and my first year was amazing. So yeah.
That's really cool. Well, some kids, don't go off to college. What made you want to go to college?
I mean, I just thought it was like a logical next step, and I know my family would be kind of raising eyebrows if I didn't. So,
Just
um,
seemed like the right fit,
and
or the
yeah,
right
and
direction.
I'd always loved school. I've always loved school. So it was like it was just natural, really. And they were like, oh, they've got the English department. So I went in through the English department, but eventually I switched over to Latin American literature. So
Mm-hmm.
it
Oh,
was,
cool.
I guess, this experience of also I wanted to sort of rediscover um, what my roots were because I was pulled out of the country so young and I never got to experience like what it's like living here. So
Yeah,
and the culture more in depth and everything.
yeah, that's neat. When you look back at, you know, you've changed a lot, obviously, and you've become who you are, and
Hmm.
things have settled down in a lot of ways for you, and gotten a lot better in a lot of ways. When you think back on the little girl who was very Christian, uh,
Hmm.
before you started having these doubts, what do you think about that person now?
I think she was very scared, and rather than express those fears and all these sort of natural emotional responses that we have as children, those were often restricted, in the name of keeping the faith alive and behaving and everything.
Yeah.
And I also think that there was a natural curiosity that I had that most children have, of course. Um, and that really sort of collected, I guess, all this information that slowly pulled me out of a belief that was not working for me.
Hmm.
So I would hug that girl and sort of recognize that she was suffering, but I would also thank her
Because,
for reading so much.
yeah, it's that curiosity that kind of carried you through and kept you learning and discovering life.
Yeah, and I owe a lot to public school, really. A lot of my teachers were, very encouraging. They always told me to keep writing and then keep doing what I was doing, and that was ultimately what I decided to dedicate myself to outside of
That's
Christianity.
really cool. Yeah, you said you're blogging.
Yes, and blogging on and off, writing.
What's something that you've experienced or learned that you don't think you would have if you had stayed Christian?
I would have never learned to trust my responses to life. One of the things that I got out of Christianity was this fear of my body as like this sort of weak, needy thing that, would lead me astray. And if it hadn't been for that experience of being sort of at war with myself or kind of like isolated from what I really feel, I wouldn't have had the experience of having to kind of forcing myself to learn to make my own, judgments on things and to trust those judgments.
That's really good advice because I think sometimes we really do know what we need to do, but
Yeah.
religion or whatever the thing is on the outside is kind of keeping that in check. But it's like you
Yeah. I
knew.
mean, lean not on your own understanding was something I heard constantly in church. And I really did internalize that because I mean, I'm so indecisive still, and not in a very dysfunctional kind of way. And I know that it's because things that feel good are scary, things that I need are scary.
Yeah. Well, God's will is this thing you have to find and you need to know in every part of your life if God approves of what you're doing and where you're going.
Exactly.
And so it kind of cultivates this like I guess like you said, lack of trust in yourself.
And a hyper awareness of everything I'm doing and feeling and thinking. It's like, is this okay to feel? Is this okay to think? Is this okay to?
Rather than just experiencing life.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah.
Hmm.
And it's almost this helplessness. You're frozen because
Yeah.
you can't trust yourself, you can't trust your instincts. Yeah.
Exactly.
Well, what is something positive about yourself that you would say stayed the same? So when you think about, the Christian little girl and then she develops into who she is today and who you are today, you went from, growing up in a very strict Christian family to being your own person and being in college. That's a huge transition. That's a lot of change. But what about you stayed the same through that whole time?
I never just drop a question that I have. And I'm very proud of that. My mother used to have a huge problem with that. She used to say, there's a phrase here in Puerto Rico that says, buscándole la quinta pata al gato, which means looking for the cat's fifth leg. And it's a person who keeps turning things over and over until they get the answer or until they're kind of looking for something that isn't even there. And so I was always so intensely curious that I would push past literally anything, including, the belief that had built my entire sense of self.
Mm-hmm.
And, my entire childhood, my world was God and Christianity and all of that. It was scary, but I had a burning question and I needed it answered.
Yes.
So, and I'm still like that now. So.
That's really cool. That's a great quality to have, is that curiosity that just like is just part of who you are, like just always inquiring and trying to find out more and scratching the surface to see, what's underneath or whatever,
Right.
That's
Yeah.
cool. Well, there's someone listening to the podcast who has just gone through deconversion. When you think about that person who may have gone through a lot of similar things that you have gone through, what encouragement or guidance would you give that person?
Reach out to other people because that helps a lot. Talk to people who you are afraid of according to your belief system. Talk to those people who you aren't supposed to talk to. Read and really trust your gut on this stuff because your body and your mind, they know what they're doing.
That's awesome.
A lot of ways.
That's
Yeah.
great. Well, what's a resource that you would recommend for that person who's deconverting?
I would definitely watch Jesus Camp. That's a great movie. I really like that
Yeah.
movie. I've been on Tumblr for years and years, and that's a really strange place where a lot of people just kind of get their ideas sort of flowing and they even clash, and there's a little ex-Christian corner of Tumblr going on there, so that's pretty cool. Oh, and also groups around campuses and stuff. I recently joined the Secular Student Alliance, so that's cool.
That's awesome. Yeah, and we both know Gerardo, who was on
Yeah.
the podcast. Yeah, and he's a great guy.
Yeah,
He seems like he's just
He really
such a
is.
positive person, and
Yeah,
so
great attitude.
yeah, you guys have a lot of really great stuff going there. The secular community in Puerto Rico. It seems like.
I'm really excited. Yeah.
Yeah, it's pretty cool. Well, is there anything that I already asked this, but is there anything we haven't discussed that you wanted to share?
I think we covered all of it.
Okay, that's awesome. Well, I really appreciate you being willing to tell your story. It takes a lot of courage to do that and to do it publicly.
Thank you.
And I'm excited to just hear how you made that journey and came through all of these difficult things. So it's really neat and it's exciting. I mean, I know that like life is difficult and we always have ups and downs, but you've come through a lot already, and that's really cool. And you've,
Yeah.
just be proud of yourself for what you come through. So
Thank you.
yeah. Well, thanks so much for coming on the podcast. It was really nice meeting you. And
Thanks a lot for having me.
yeah.
This was a really great experience for me.
Thanks for listening to Voices of Deconversion. Be sure to join us next time by subscribing to the podcast. If you'd like to learn more, check out our newsletter at bodpodcast.com.